I knew the second I saw that support post that this wasn't going to end with a friendly conversation. It wasn't going to end with a handshake, a quick apology, or one of those awkward neighbor compromises where everybody pretends they're happy just to keep the peace. No. The moment I backed my truck out of the driveway and nearly clipped a brand new wooden beam that hadn't been there the week before, I had a feeling something was very, very wrong. At the time, I'd been living in that house for almost 11 years in a quiet little town outside Cedar Ridge, Pennsylvania. Not the kind of place that ever made the news. Just a sleepy neighborhood where people waved while mowing their lawns and complained about property taxes over coffee at the diner. My house wasn't special, but it was mine. I knew every inch of that property. I knew where the grass grew thicker after heavy rain. I knew which fence boards needed replacing every spring. I even knew how the afternoon shadows stretched across my driveway during different seasons because I'd spent so many years watching them. That driveway mattered more than most people would understand. It ran along the side of the house all the way back to a detached workshop where I kept my tools, my riding mower, and way too many half-finished projects that I kept promising myself I'd get around to someday. For years, my neighbor had been an older guy named Harold. Harold respected boundaries. Literally. If he needed to step onto my property for any reason, he'd ask first. If one of his grandkids accidentally rode a bike across my driveway, he'd apologize before I even noticed. We weren't best friends, but we understood each other. Then Harold moved to Florida, and everything changed. The new owners arrived in early April. A couple named Blake and Michelle Turner. Blake was one of those guys who seemed friendly at first glance, but something about him always felt slightly off, like he was performing friendliness instead of actually feeling it. You know the type. Firm handshake, big smile, never quite makes eye contact. Michelle was quieter, nice enough, but every time Blake spoke, she had this look that suggested she'd already spent years cleaning up after his decisions. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. We exchanged waves, talked about the weather, compared lawn care equipment, the usual suburban stuff. Then construction materials started showing up. First it was stacks of lumber, then pallets of concrete, then steel framing. Every day, there seemed to be more. One afternoon, I wandered over while Blake was unloading supplies. Building something big? I asked. He grinned, finally getting the garage I've always wanted. I looked around his lot. It wasn't huge. Actually, it was pretty narrow, and for a split second, something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't explain why. Just one of those little instincts you get after living somewhere long enough. Still, I shrugged it off. Surely they'd checked permits. Surely they'd measured everything. Surely nobody would spend that kind of money without knowing where their property line actually was, right? Construction moved fast, almost suspiciously fast. Within 2 weeks, the foundation was poured. Another week, and the framing was standing. By the end of the month, the structure already looked halfway complete. Every day when I came home from work, it seemed bigger, closer, more imposing. I remember standing in my yard one evening with my coffee, staring at it as the sun was setting. Something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong, just wrong enough to keep tugging at the back of my mind. Then came the morning, everything clicked. I was backing my truck out like I'd done thousands of times before. Coffee in the cup holder, local radio playing, nothing unusual. Then suddenly I hit the brakes. Hard. My side mirror stopped inches from a freshly installed support post. For a second, I thought I'd made a mistake. Maybe I drifted too far. Maybe I was distracted. I put the truck in park and climbed out. That's when I looked up, and my stomach dropped. The edge of Blake's new garage wasn't merely close to my driveway. It was hanging over it, actually hanging over it, several feet. A huge section of the roof extended directly above property that belonged to me. I stood there staring at it, blinking, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. But I wasn't. The longer I looked, the more obvious it became. That garage wasn't built beside my driveway. Part of it was built over my driveway. And standing there in the early morning light, looking at that shadow stretching across my property, I realized something else. This wasn't an accident that had happened yesterday. This had been happening for weeks. I just hadn't noticed until now. And for the first time since Blake moved in, I started wondering whether he already knew exactly what he'd done. That thought stayed with me all day. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. Maybe the property line wasn't exactly where I remembered it. I kept giving Blake the benefit of the doubt because, honestly, that's what most reasonable people do. Nobody wants a fight with a person living 20 feet away from them. But by the time I got home that evening, curiosity had turned into concern. I walked over while Blake was organizing tools near the new garage. The smell of fresh lumber was still hanging in the air. A nail gun sat on a workbench. The whole place looked like a project that was already too far along to easily undo. "Hey, Blake," I said casually. "I think part of your garage might be crossing over onto my property." He didn't look surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. No confusión. No shock. No immediate concern. Just a small chuckle. "Nah," he said. "We're good." I glanced up at the overhang. It looks pretty far over from where I'm standing. The contractor measured everything. His answer came so fast it sounded rehearsed. "You get a survey done?" He shrugged. "Builder handled all that." Then he looked toward my driveway and added something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. "It's only a few feet. You can still get through, right?" "Not, let me check." "Not, we should make sure." "Not, if there's a problem, we'll fix it." "Just, you can still get through, right?" Like my property rights depended on whether his mistake was inconvenient enough. I nodded. "All right." Then I walked back home. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't threaten anything. Because at that moment, I realized the conversation wasn't going to solve this. Evidence would. That night, I dug through old filing cabinets in my office. Property records, closing documents, survey maps from when I bought the house, stacks of paperwork I'd barely touched in years. By midnight, my dining room table looked like a legal archive. The more I reviewed everything, the more convinced I became that the garage was exactly where I feared it was. The next morning, I called a licensed surveyor named Evan Ross. A coworker had recommended him years earlier after a fence dispute. Apparently, Evan was the kind of guy who treated property lines the way surgeons treat arteries. Precise, methodical, unemotional. 3 days later, he arrived. The man barely said hello before unloading equipment. Tripods, GPS units, markers, measuring gear that looked expensive enough to launch satellites. For hours, he worked across both properties, checking angles, comparing records, cross-referencing coordinates. I watched from my porch with a cup of coffee, trying not to look nervous. Deep down, though, I already knew what he was going to find. Around lunchtime, he waved me over. Bright orange stakes now ran in a perfectly straight line along the edge of my driveway. The line looked almost surgical, like someone had sliced reality into 2 separate pieces. Evan tapped one of the stakes with his boot, then pointed toward Blake's garage. "Yeah," he said. "That's over. Simple, direct, no drama, just facts." "How far?" I asked. He checked his notes. "About 4 feet at the structure." Then he pointed toward the roof, closer to 5 at the overhang. For some reason, hearing the actual number made it feel worse. Suspicion leaves room for doubt. Measurements don't. I thanked him and paid the invoice. Before he left, I asked for a complete report. Photos, coordinates, everything. That evening, my email arrived. 43 pages. Professional documentation from start to finish. The kind of evidence that doesn't care about opinions. The next morning, I printed 2 copies. One for me, one for Blake. I walked across the yard and knocked on his door. Michelle answered. She looked surprised to see me. "Is Blake home?" A few seconds later, he appeared. I handed him the report. Survey came back. He flipped through maybe 3 pages. Not enough to actually read anything. Then he closed it. "Look," he said, "moving that garage would cost a fortune." I stared at him. For a second, I honestly thought I'd missed part of the conversation, because he hadn't denied it, hadn't questioned the survey, hadn't argued with the measurements. He'd skipped straight to explaining why he wasn't going to fix it. "It's on my property," I said. He sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, then gave me a half smile. "You've still got plenty of driveway." There was again that same attitude. The assumption that what belonged to me somehow became negotiable if correcting it became expensive for him. Something changed inside me right then. Not anger, not rage, clarity. Until that moment, I'd been treating this like a misunderstanding. Now I understood it wasn't. Blake knew exactly what the problem was. He simply didn't think I'd do anything about it. I took the report back. "All right," that was all I said. Then I walked away. Over the next several days, the practical consequences became impossible to ignore. My pickup could still squeeze through, but barely. Backing into the workshop became an exercise in geometry. Any larger vehicle would have serious problems. The timing couldn't have been worse because my younger sister, Rebecca, was preparing to move across town. I'd already promised to help transport furniture using a rented box truck. One look at the garage overhang, and I knew there was no chance that truck was making it down my driveway. Every trip in and out became a reminder. Every glance upward felt like an insult. Part of my property had effectively been stolen, and the person responsible couldn't have cared less. That's when I stopped focusing on the garage itself and started researching options. Not lawsuits. I didn't want a lawsuit. Court battles drag on forever. They drain money. They drain energy. They drain peace. I wanted something simpler, something practical, something legal. Night after night, I sat in my office reading county ordinances, access regulations, property codes, easement laws, and building restrictions. Most of it was mind-numbingly boring. Pages and pages of language clearly written by people who hated punctuation. Then one evening, I found a section that made me stop reading and start smiling. I read it once, then again, then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The ordinance allowed homeowners to install protective clearance systems to guarantee safe vehicle access on private driveways whenever overhead interference could create potential hazards. I leaned back in my chair, read it one more time, and slowly a very interesting idea began forming in my head. Not revenge, at least not exactly. More like adaptation. Because if Blake wanted to pretend his garage belonged over my driveway, maybe it was time to remind him exactly where that driveway started. The funny thing about good ideas is that they usually sound ridiculous for the first 5 minutes. Mine certainly did. I remember sitting in my office staring at that ordinance, spinning a pen between my fingers and thinking, no way this is actually going to work. Then the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. The law was clear. My driveway was a private access route. I had the right to maintain safe clearance for vehicles entering and exiting my property. Nothing in the ordinance said I needed permission from a neighbor. Nothing said I had to consider the convenience of a structure that shouldn't have been hanging over my land in the first place. By the end of the week, I'd hired a local metal fabrication company. I kept my requests simple. 2 steel posts, 1 crossbar, heavy duty, permanent, functional, and very carefully measured. The crew showed up early on a Tuesday morning. Their truck rumbled onto the street just after sunrise. The sound alone was enough to get attention. Within minutes, Blake and Michelle were standing outside, watching from across the property line. The workers unloaded steel beams while another guy began marking locations at the entrance of my driveway. Blake eventually walked over, hands on his hips, trying to sound casual, failing completely. What are you building? I looked up from the plans. Height clearance bar. His forehead wrinkled. For what? Safe access. That was all I said. The confusion on his face was almost entertaining. Not because I was enjoying his discomfort. At least that's what I told myself. But because for the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't seem completely certain of how things were going to end. The installation took most of the day. Concrete footings, steel supports, final measurements. I personally checked the clearance before the crossbar went up. 7 feet. Exactly. Not 6'11". Not 7'1". Exactly 7 feet. When everything was finished, the structure looked surprisingly professional, like it had always belonged there. My truck passed underneath without issue. Plenty of room. Everything worked exactly as intended. Then the crew packed up and left. And all that remained was a simple black steel bar stretching across the entrance to my driveway. Quiet. Motionless. Patient. Waiting. The realization didn't hit Blake immediately. It took about 2 days, which honestly made the payoff even better. I was sitting by my front window Saturday afternoon when I saw him pull his truck around toward the garage. I wasn't spying, at least not technically. The window just happened to face that direction. He lined up carefully, started rolling forward, then stopped, got out, looked at the clearance bar, looked at the garage, looked back at the truck. I could practically hear the gears turning inside his head. He climbed back in, tried another angle, backed up, pulled forward again, adjusted, stopped, adjusted again, stopped again. Because the problem wasn't the clearance bar. The problem was geometry. To properly access the garage, vehicles needed to swing partially across my driveway. That path now required compliance with a height restriction. A restriction his own garage violated before he could even complete the turn. I watched him try for nearly 15 minutes. At one point, he inched forward so slowly, I thought he might attempt to force it. Then common sense finally won. He backed out and drove away. No shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic meltdown, just quiet frustration. The kind that settles into your bones when reality finally catches up to a bad decision. The following weeks were interesting. Michelle's sedan could technically make it work if she approached from exactly the right angle. Every attempt looked like someone threading a needle during an earthquake. Slow, careful, stressful. Meanwhile, the giant garage they'd rushed to build slowly transformed into an expensive storage shed. Boxes, ladders, holiday decorations, tools. Everything except the one thing it was supposedly built for. Bariclas. And that's when something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling angry. Seriously. The resentment I'd been carrying around started fading. Because I realized I wasn't actually fighting Blake anymore. Reality was, every day that garage remained unusable, it delivered the exact same message I had been trying to explain from the beginning. Boundaries matter. About 2 weeks later, there was a knock on my door. Late afternoon. The sun was beginning to drop behind the trees. I opened it and found Blake standing there. The difference was immediate. Gone was the confident smile. Gone was the dismissive attitude. He looked exhausted, like a man who'd spent several nights doing financial calculations he didn't enjoy. "Hey," he said quietly. "Got a minute?" I stepped onto the porch. We stood there for a few seconds, neither of us speaking. Finally, he gestured toward the driveway, then toward the garage. "This isn't working." There it was. The first honest thing he'd said since this whole mess began. I nodded. "No, it isn't." He exhaled slowly. "We can't get the truck in." I said nothing. Even Michelle's car barely clears it. Still nothing. Then came the question that changed everything. "So what do we do?" Not "what are you going to do?" Now what can we work out? What do we do? For the first time, he wasn't talking at me. He was talking with me. I leaned against the porch railing. The answer was simple. Move the garage. He laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it wasn't. That's expensive. I shrugged. So was building it. Silence. Long silence. The kind where both people already know the outcome. Finally, he nodded. Slowly. "Yeah." Another pause. Then he looked down at his shoes. "We'll fix it." And to his credit, he did. A few weeks later, construction crews returned. This time the work moved slower. More carefully. Sections of the overhang were removed. Structural modifications were made. The offending corner was pulled completely back inside his property line. No shortcuts, no arguments, no excuses. When everything was finished, Blake walked over and showed me the result. I checked the measurements myself. Everything was clean. Everything was legal. Everything was where it should have been from day one. A few days later, I called the metal company. They removed the clearance bar exactly as promised. The driveway returned to normal. Open, unobstructed, peaceful. In theory, anyway. Because while the physical problem disappeared, something else never fully recovered. Trust. Blake and I still live next to each other. We wave. We say hello. We talk about weather and lawn maintenance. The same surface-level neighbor conversations everybody has. But that easy friendliness from the beginning never came back. Maybe it couldn't. Some lines, once crossed, leave marks even after they're moved back. Every now and then I still think about the whole thing. Not because of the garage. Not because of the argument, but because I wonder what would have happened if I'd simply accepted it. If I looked at those missing few feet and decided they weren't worth defending. Would that have been the end of it? Or would there have been another boundary pushed later? Another assumption? Another expectation? I'll never know. All I do know is this. Standing your ground doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it doesn't require fighting at all. Sometimes it just means understanding the rules better than the person trying to ignore them, then letting reality do the talking. Now here's what I'd genuinely like to know from you. Was I right to install that clearance bar? Was it a fair response to someone building over my property? Or did I go too far and force the issue when I should have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because people seem to land on both sides of this one. And honestly, even after everything that happened, I'm still curious where you would draw the line if you were standing in my driveway.